March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The oxygen mask clung to Major Hans Kogler's frozen face as he peered through the crystal canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf-109G6. Below, a sheet of white cloud stretched to the horizon. Ahead, the contrails of bombers marked the path of a new kind of war. He was leading his mixed formation toward what his ground controllers had promised would be an unescorted bomber stream, an easy kill this deep inside the Reich. Then the warning cut through the static of his headset. Achtung! Single-engine fighters with drop tanks, 12 o'clock high. Kogler's blood turned to ice. American single-engine fighters here? Over Brandenburg? Barely 50 miles from Berlin? That was impossible. Every calculation, every report from intelligence said Allied fighters couldn't fly this far. The P-47 Thunderbolt ran out of fuel near the Rhine. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a clear day, but Brandenburg was beyond reach. And yet, through the thin air, Kogler saw silver shapes growing larger, slicing through the sunlight with easy grace. They weren't thunderbolts. They weren't lightnings. These were something else entirely. Sleek, long-nosed with squared wingtips that glinted like polished blades, North American P-51 Mustangs. Before we go deeper, pause for a second. If stories like this make you feel the shiver of history, then make sure you subscribe and join us. Every week we uncover forgotten moments that change the world. Tap that button and in the comments tell us where you're watching from, because tonight, we're flying straight into the sky that broke the Luftwaffe's spirit. Now back to March 6, 1944. For 5 years, the German Air Force had dominated Europe's skies. Its pilots were legends, its aircraft masterpieces of engineering. But as Kogler watched those Mustangs carve contrails through the thin air above Berlin's outskirts, he sensed something greater than danger. He sensed the end of everything he believed in. Below them, 730 heavy bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force were pushing toward Berlin itself. This wasn't a feint or diversion. It was a direct assault on the capital of the Third Reich. And for the first time in history, single-engine fighters would fly with them all the way to the target, and all the way home. No one in Kogler's formation could comprehend what they were seeing. It wasn't just enemy aircraft in the sky. It was the destruction of the mathematical certainty that had defined German air defense since 1939. Every table, every fuel calculation, every strategic plan assumed the Americans could never escort bombers this deep. Yet here they were. The psychological impact would ripple through the Luftwaffe like a shockwave. Only months earlier, in January 1944, German squadrons had begun to notice something strange. Major Hermann Graf of JG-11 had reported seeing American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles farther east than physics should have allowed. His superiors dismissed it as fatigue or misidentification. When more sightings followed, Hanover, Magdeburg, even near Leipzig, the Reich Air Ministry issued an order. Such claims were errors or hallucinations. Any pilot repeating them would face medical evaluation, but reality doesn't bow to orders. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had been quietly rewriting the laws of range. They hadn't broken physics. They'd simply used it more cleverly than anyone expected. Their solution lay in 2 revolutionary advances: a new heart for the Mustang, the Packard-built Merlin V1653 engine, and a set of lightweight disposable fuel tanks made of nothing more than paper, resin, and genius. Until then, every German engineer agreed it was impossible for a single-engine fighter to fly more than 280 miles from its base and still fight effectively. Fuel consumption and drag made the math brutal, but in Detroit, Packard's machinists were building engines so precise they could keep delivering power even at 30,000 feet. Each engine produced almost 1,500 horsepower at sea level and still over 1,200 horsepower at altitude, numbers that made even the proud Daimler-Benz 605 look clumsy. When Oberfeldwebel, Konrad Bauer, a technical specialist with JG-26, examined a crashed P-51 near Gütersloh in February 1944, he couldn't believe what he saw. "The workmanship," he wrote in his report, "is beyond anything we can match. The intercooler system alone is more advanced than our entire DB605 installation, and they say the Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. 3 per hour. That line said it all. Germany was fighting a war of pilots. America was fighting a war of production lines. The second secret was even simpler and more devastating. The 108-gallon drop tank, made of laminated craft paper soaked in plastic resin. It weighed just 35 pounds empty, light, cheap, and disposable. It held enough fuel for 5 hours of flight, just long enough to reach Berlin, drop the tanks, and fight with full power. German engineers had tried auxiliary tanks before, but they were heavy metal constructions meant to be reused. The Americans treated theirs like bullets: use once, discard, move on. That philosophy, efficiency over perfection, was something the Reich never understood. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group described the new freedom it gave his pilots. We could burn fuel like millionaires, fly to Berlin on the paper tanks, drop them, fight, and still have half a tank to get home. For the first time, we had margin. We had freedom. Freedom was exactly what the German pilots were about to lose. To grasp how earth-shattering this was, you need to remember what came before. October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses had attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range escort. 60 were shot down. 138 limped home riddled with holes. 600 airmen dead or missing. 1 in 5 bombers lost in a single day. After that massacre, American commanders suspended deep raids. General Adolf Galland, Germany's celebrated fighter leader, declared that daylight bombing had proven impossible. In his memoir, The First and the Last, he wrote proudly, "After Schweinfurt, we knew daylight precision bombing was a dead idea. The Americans would have to bomb at night like the British. We had won the argument. He was wrong. The Americans didn't retreat. They reinvented." And when whispers of a new long-range escort reached Galland's desk late that year, he dismissed them with a smile. Reports of single-engine fighters near Hanover? Nonsense, he said. Mice identifications, fatigue. But the illusion collapsed during Big Week, February 1944. For 7 days, the skies over Germany became a storm of fire. 1,000 bombers, 835 escorts. For the first time, hundreds of P-51Bs joined the fight. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and, worse, 100 veteran pilots, 17% of its elite in a single week. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Adolf's younger brother, wrote afterward, "The Mustangs changed everything. Before we could stage our attacks outside fighter range, move in with precision and leave. Now we had to fight through escorts to reach the bombers and fight again to get home. Every mission became a battle for survival. And that was only the beginning." March 6th dawned cloudless and cold across northern Europe. At RAF Leiston in England, ground crews worked through the night preparing the 357th Fighter Group. Colonel Henry Spicer briefed his men at 6 a.m. "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B, the whole way, 4 hours over enemy territory. If your aircraft isn't perfect, abort now." No one did. At 8:30, the first waves of bombers lifted from East Anglia. Behind them, nearly 800 fighters rolled down the runways, P-47s to start the journey, P-38s for mid-escort, and the P-51s for the deepest leg. The mission: escort 730 bombers straight to Berlin. Over the North Sea, radar operators in Germany watched their screens bloom with new echoes. At Doberitz, the main defense center for the capital, officers debated whether it was real. The Americans had feinted toward Berlin before, always turning away to strike secondary targets. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of the 2nd Fighter Division, decided to wait. "We'll hold our fighters until they commit," he said. "No need to waste fuel." Fuel, that word would soon haunt every German pilot. By late morning, the bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. The P-47s fought swirling dogfights with interceptors rising from Holland. Everything seemed normal. But as the big thunderbolts began to peel away, the Germans relaxed, certain the escorts were turning back. Then came the Mustangs, Major Thomas L. Hayes, now leading the 357th after Colonel Spicer's plane developed mechanical trouble, broke through the cloud layer and saw the bomber formations below, and above them, dots of enemy fighters preparing to dive. "They hadn't seen us," Hayes wrote later. "We had altitude, we had surprise. I called, 'Greenhouse leader to all squadrons, bandits 2 o'clock low, drop tanks and attack.' Below, Feldwebel Jan Müller of JG-11 was moments from beginning his attack on the bombers when the sky erupted with tracers. They came out of the sun, he recalled after the war. At first, I thought they were captured planes, some deception. Then I saw the American stars and the tanks falling away. That's when I knew it was real. They were here, over Berlin. In 12 minutes of chaos, 20 German aircraft were shot down. Not one Mustang was lost. When the survivors limped back to base, they brought a story no one believed. At his estate north of Berlin, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was having lunch when the phone rang. General Galland's voice trembled. "American fighters are over Berlin. Single-engine fighters." "You're mistaken," Göring snapped. "Check your reports again." "Mein Reichsmarschall," Galland insisted, "we have multiple confirmations. P-51s are engaging our fighters over Potsdam." Göring's fury was volcanic. He hurled his glass against the wall, shouting, "Treason! Lies, the pilots are cowards spreading defeatist talk." But when he stepped to the window, even he could see it. The pale scars of contrails over the capital. The sound of engines faint but unmistakable. That night, he issued one of the most infamous orders in aviation history. Any pilot claiming to have seen single-engine fighters over Berlin was to be arrested for cowardice and spreading false reports. "The maximum range of American fighters," he declared, "is the Ruhr." That is scientific fact. Science, however, had already left him behind. Within days, wreckage of a drop tank was recovered near Magdeburg, clearly stamped "Made in USA." Galland slammed it down on Göring's desk. Göring glared and said, "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. They cannot escort to Berlin. It's impossible." Galland later wrote, "In that moment I knew the war was lost." From that day forward, every German pilot who looked up at the gleaming silver fighters circling above knew the same. The Reich was no longer a fortress. Its skies belonged to someone else. And somewhere in that vast formation, American pilots felt it too, the shift of history, the certainty that the balance had finally tipped. The day the Mustangs reached Berlin was the day the Luftwaffe's heart cracked. The shock from March 6, 1944 spread through the Luftwaffe like a virus. Pilots who had once laughed at the idea of American fighters over Berlin now whispered about it in mess halls and airfields. The skies that had once felt like home suddenly felt haunted. Every distant glint of silver brought the same question. Is it them again? Major Hans Kogler, the man who first saw the impossible that day, wrote in his logbook that night, "Everything has changed. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere." And he was right. The psychological damage was more powerful than any bullet. German fighter pilots had built their pride on one unshakable belief, that inside Germany's borders they were safe to climb, refuel, regroup, and strike again. That illusion vanished in a single afternoon. From that moment, even the most experienced aces began to hesitate. They still took off, still fought, but the confidence, the sense of invincibility was gone. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was a message written in metal and fuel. Your skies are no longer yours. The effect was immediate and merciless. In the following weeks, the Mustang turned Germany's defensive map upside down. Every industrial city that had once been beyond fighter range was suddenly exposed. Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, even the oil plants deep in Silesia. German commanders had no answer. To make matters worse, the Luftwaffe was bleeding from within. Every battle took away not just planes but irreplaceable pilots. The veterans of 1939 and 1940, men who had dominated Europe's skies, were dying faster than replacements could be trained. At the start of 1944, new German pilots received around 250 hours of flight instruction. By the end of that year, they got barely 80. Some were sent into combat with less than 30 hours in the air. One young pilot remembered being told, "Don't worry, you'll learn faster under fire." He never returned from his second mission. The Americans, meanwhile, were doing the opposite. Their pilots arrived in England with more than 400 hours of training and combat practice. Many had already flown mock battles against experienced instructors who taught them how to fight and survive. The difference showed in the air. When the Mustangs came, they came high, fast, and disciplined. German pilots who tried to climb to meet them found the Americans already above them. Those who tried to dive away found the Mustangs right on their tails. Their engines roared with power even at altitude. their long wings slicing through the thin air with grace that no German aircraft could match. One Luftwaffe pilot, Unteroffizier Peter Weber, described it bluntly. "We used to say, we'll attack the bombers and get out before the escort arrives." But the Mustangs were already there, waiting. They didn't just escort the bombers, they owned the sky. And the Americans knew it. Every Mustang pilot had a simple mission: protect the bombers at all costs. And if you see enemy fighters, hunt them down. The result was a constant storm of small battles across Germany's sky. Dogfights that left trails of smoke, broken wings, and falling parachutes over towns that had once been untouchable. But the real devastation wasn't just in the air. It was in Germany's fuel. The Reich had no natural oil reserves. Every drop of aviation gasoline came from synthetic fuel plants, massive industrial complexes that turned coal into liquid energy. These plants were the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. Without them, no aircraft could fly. For years they had been safe. The Americans couldn't reach them. Now, with the Mustang, that changed overnight. On May 12, 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a new kind of mission. 800 bombers, protected by more than 700 fighters, attacked the synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Merseburg. The result was catastrophic. Production fell by 90% in a single day. In June, another strike followed, then another. Within months, the Reich's entire fuel supply collapsed. By the summer of 1944, German pilots were told to conserve every drop. Training flights were canceled. Missions were limited to 15 minutes over enemy territory. Some squadrons received so little fuel that only one aircraft in 10 could fly at all. The Luftwaffe still had thousands of planes on paper, but most sat silent on the ground, empty tanks gleaming in the sun. A veteran pilot from JG-300 later said, "We had aircraft, we had guns, but no fuel. We were like birds with our wings cut off." The Americans, meanwhile, flew endlessly. Their supply lines ran like arteries across the Atlantic. Every day, more planes, more fuel, more men. Every morning, the silver formations rose from England like clockwork, heading east. Each raid brought fresh humiliation. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe could barely take off. Allied air forces flew nearly 15,000 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Germans managed just over 300, and of those, only 2 aircraft actually reached the beaches of Normandy. 2. They belonged to Major Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk. They dove on the Allied ships, fired their guns in one desperate pass, and fled, chased by a swarm of Spitfires. Priller later wrote, "2 planes, that was the entire Luftwaffe over Normandy. Not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel. The Mustangs had taken our skies long before D-Day. From that moment, Germany's air war became one long retreat. Desperate, the Luftwaffe turned to extreme tactics. Squadrons called Sturmgruppen were formed, heavily armored Focke-Wulfs designed to smash through bomber formations at point-blank range. Pilots were ordered to keep attacking even if their guns jammed, to ram enemy bombers if necessary. At first, they had some success. In July 1944, a Sturmgruppe led by Major Walter Dahl destroyed 12 B-24 Liberators in 1 minute. But it was suicide. The Mustangs tore them apart before they could escape. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, who survived several Sturm missions, described the horror. "We were flying coffins. The armor slowed us so much that the Mustangs could circle us like wolves. Every mission felt like Russian roulette with all the chambers loaded. Germany's only hope was new technology, the jet fighter Me-262, the fastest aircraft in the world. It could outrun any Mustang. But it came too late. Hitler, obsessed with turning it into a bomber, delayed its use as a fighter for months. By the time the Me-262 finally entered combat, the Luftwaffe had no fuel to fly it and no experienced pilots left to master it. Adolf Galland, who had once mocked reports of Mustangs over Berlin, now commanded a handful of Me-262s in 1945. Even he admitted, "We would shoot down 1 or 2 bombers and return to find our base under attack by Mustangs. They waited for us in the sky. For every minute we were airborne, they owned the air for an hour." By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's decline had become irreversible. The numbers told a grim story. In 1940, new German pilots got 250 hours of training. In 1945, they were lucky to get 20. Their life expectancy was 7 missions. Some didn't even last that long. At the same time, American pilot quality kept rising. They were confident, rested, well-fed, and armed with aircraft that worked flawlessly. The contrast was heartbreaking. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's top aces, later said, "We began sending children to their deaths. They had never fired their guns in flight. We were no longer an air force, we were a graveyard." Production numbers painted the same tragedy. Germany built more fighters in 1944 than in 1943, over 25,000 aircraft, but they were destroyed faster than they could be made. In September 1944 alone, they lost more planes than they produced. Many new aircraft were poorly built in underground factories by exhausted laborers using substandard parts. Engines failed after 10 hours. Guns jammed. Wings cracked in flight. Engineer Kurt Tank, creator of the FW-190, visited a unit that December and was horrified. "We were delivering death traps," he said. "Our men were flying machines that should never have left the factory." Desperation drove the Luftwaffe to madness. On New Year's Day 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium. 900 fighters took off, most flown by barely trained pilots. Many were shot down by German anti-aircraft guns who hadn't been told of the mission. The attack destroyed 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, but Germany lost 270 of its own, including 200 pilots. It was the Luftwaffe's death blow. One surviving pilot called it our death ride. He said, "We destroyed machines the Americans replaced in a week, but we lost men we could never replace." Within days, Mustang squadrons swept across Germany, strafing airfields, fuel depots, and trains. The few remaining Luftwaffe aircraft were caught on the ground helpless. Major John Meyer of the U.S. 352nd Fighter Group said, "It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution." By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only in reports. On paper, hundreds of aircraft still stood ready. In reality, almost none could fly. Pilots sat beside grounded planes listening to the distant thunder of American engines overhead. Many refused to take off. Not from fear, but from logic. There was no point. The war in the air was lost. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who had once been one of the Luftwaffe's brightest young officers, wrote his final diary entry that winter. "We are targets now, not hunters. The Mustangs are everywhere. We have no fuel, no hope, no future." He was right. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe was gone. By the dawn of 1945, the German Luftwaffe was only a shadow of what it had been. The skies over Germany were no longer blue. They were silver, streaked with contrails that belonged to someone else. Every sunrise brought the same distant hum of engines that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound of the Mustang. At airfields scattered across the Reich, the last surviving pilots stared at their grounded aircraft and knew the truth. They no longer controlled the sky. What had once been their proudest domain had become their open grave. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was slow, cruel, and absolute. One mission after another ended in disaster. Every time a squadron took off, it lost men it could never replace. Every German pilot still alive was fighting the war's most impossible equation. No fuel, no time, no chance. In the spring of 1944, Germany had 2,400 operational fighter pilots. By January 1945, there were barely 700. By April, fewer than 200 were still flying. Of all the Luftwaffe pilots who had been on active duty a year earlier, fewer than 5% survived the war without injury. They called it der Tod der Experten, the death of the experts. One by one, the aces who had once been untouchable were falling from the sky. Men with hundreds of victories were now shot down by young American pilots barely out of college. Skill and experience no longer mattered against overwhelming numbers and machines that never ran out of fuel. Inside Germany, the situation was even worse than the pilots realized. Every factory that still produced aircraft was now a target. Every railway line, every fuel plant, every airfield was under constant attack. The Mustangs' range meant that no part of Germany was safe. The Americans had achieved something new in the history of war: total air supremacy. Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, would later admit, "The Mustangs allowed the Americans to keep pressure on us without pause. We would repair a factory, resume production, and days later they would destroy it again. Our industry became a carousel of ruin." Even though Germany built more fighters in 1944 than ever before, over 25,000, the losses were even greater. In September alone, the Luftwaffe lost 3,200 aircraft and 3,000 pilots. Every week seemed to erase a year of effort. At the front lines, the veterans watched the end unfold in slow motion. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected aces, described it later. "We stopped looking at the new pilots' faces. We knew most would be dead within a week. Each day began the same way. The alarm sounded. Engines sputtered to life. Pilots took off into a sky they no longer believed in. Some didn't even fight back when they met Mustangs. They just turned away, trying to survive a few minutes longer. For the Mustang pilots, it was different. They were young, bold, and fearless. To them, this was a job, and dangerous but just. Every day they took to the air knowing they were bringing the war closer to its end. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, said, "The P-51 was an honest airplane. It did what you asked it to do." Against the Germans, it was like fighting with a rifle when they had muskets. For German pilots, those words weren't an insult. They were a grim truth. Their machines were beautiful but obsolete. Their enemies' machines were simple but unstoppable. In January 1945, Germany launched its final desperate air offensive, Operation Bodenplatte. 900 fighters attacked Allied airfields in Belgium. For a few hours it worked. 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground. But the price was catastrophic. 270 German aircraft were shot down, and more than 200 pilots were killed or captured. Most were irreplaceable veterans. A Luftwaffe pilot who survived that day called it our funeral flight. He said, "We burned the last fuel we had for one moment of revenge. After that, we were finished." Within a week, the Mustangs returned to those same airfields and erased what was left. One American pilot described it as hunting ghosts. The truth was inescapable. Germany was losing not just its planes, but its faith. The same pilots who had once believed the Reich could never fall were now flying without purpose, without hope. Heinz Knock wrote in his journal, "I have lost so many friends I can no longer count them. Every morning we take off and every evening we bury someone. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. We are no longer defenders of the Reich. We are its final victims." Even Göring, the man who had once promised Hitler that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over Germany, could no longer pretend. He would stand at his window for hours watching the contrails above Berlin. When he was asked later when he knew the war was lost, he answered simply, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin." By the spring of 1945, those fighters were everywhere. They escorted bombers, hunted trains, attacked convoys, and strafed airfields. The P-51 had become a symbol of the war's inevitable end. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, Mustangs patrolled the skies above the ruins. There was no longer anyone to fight. The Luftwaffe was gone, not defeated in battle, but erased by relentless attrition. After the war, even Germany's survivors admitted it openly. Adolf Galland said, "The P-51 was the decisive weapon in the air war over Europe. It wasn't the best in everything, but it was good at everything and could fly anywhere. When it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost." That realization cut deeper than defeat. It was a psychological collapse from which Germany never recovered. The nation that had boasted of technological superiority was brought down by the very thing it mocked: mass production, teamwork, and adaptation. The Mustang was more than an airplane. It was a philosophy made real. The belief that good ideas, shared and refined, could defeat even the most fearsome machines of tyranny. For the Americans, it became a symbol of freedom. For the Germans, it was a mirror showing how deeply they had been lied to. When the war ended, the Mustang's sound, that high, clean whine of its Merlin engine, became the sound of victory. To this day, veterans can recognize it instantly. They say it brings back the feeling of freedom and, for others, the memory of fear. Historians still debate numbers and statistics, but the truth is simple. When the Mustangs reached Berlin, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. It was only a matter of time. And for those who lived through it, the lesson was clear. The future belongs to those who adapt, who learn, and who never stop building better ways to fly. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies above Germany were strangely calm. For years, those skies had roared with thunder and death, filled with smoke trails, fire, and falling metal. Now, only the low hum of American Mustangs could be heard circling above the ruins of a country that once believed it ruled the air. The Luftwaffe was gone. Its proud eagle insignia meant nothing now. Airfields were littered with burned-out wrecks, once elegant fighters, now silent skeletons on blackened runways. The pilots who had survived walked among them in silence, some too young to understand how everything had ended so quickly. The same men who once swore that no enemy would ever reach Berlin now watched American pilots fly lazy circles over their capital. For them, it was more than defeat. It was a complete collapse of faith. At one airfield outside Munich, a captured German pilot pointed to a parked Mustang and said quietly, "That airplane destroyed us." He didn't mean the guns or the bombs or even the pilots. He meant what it represented: organization, innovation, and power that Germany could no longer match. The numbers told only part of the story. Between 1944 and 1945, the Luftwaffe lost around 45,000 aircraft. 15,000 pilots were killed. Of those who had flown at the start of 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. The Mustang had been the instrument of that destruction, but it had also been something else: proof that freedom could outfight fear. For American pilots, the end brought mixed emotions. Many were barely 20 years old, boys who had spent the last 2 years watching friends vanish in flames. When victory came, there was no cheering in the cockpits, only quiet relief. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. 2 years ago, they were bombing London. Now we own the sky above Berlin. It's hard to describe how that feels. Like justice, like the world finally turning right again." For German civilians, that same sky carried another meaning. They had been told for years that America was weak, decadent, and incapable of matching German might. But when they saw those silver fighters glinting over the ruins of Berlin, unchallenged, they understood that everything they had been told was a lie. One woman wrote in her diary, "We were told our Luftwaffe would protect us. But the sky itself betrayed that lie. The Americans were above us and our own planes were gone." The sound of those engines was the sound of truth. For the bomber crews who had survived the deadly early years, the Mustang meant something far simpler: life. Sergeant James McMahon, a gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress, said, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like a death sentence. We'd watch our escorts turn back and we'd be alone. Then they came, those beautiful silver birds, and they stayed with us all the way. When I saw Mustangs outside my window over Berlin, I cried. For the first time, I believed I might make it home." Behind every Mustang pilot was an army of workers who had built the planes, men and women in California, Texas, and Michigan who had never seen combat but whose hands had shaped victory. In one North American aviation plant, a worker said, "We used to think we were just building machines. But when we saw the newsreels of those planes escorting the bombers home, we realized we were building life." At its peak, North American aviation produced one Mustang every 63 minutes. Housewives, mechanics, and teenagers worked side by side. They built them faster than Germany could shoot them down. It was industrial democracy turned into a weapon. For Germany, the contrast was devastating. Their factories were hidden in caves, scattered in forests, built by forced laborers who had no reason to care whether the planes flew or fell. Quality collapsed. Sabotage became common. Engineers like Kurt Tank admitted after the war that they were producing flying coffins. The war of industry had already been decided before the last bullet was fired. Even after victory, the Mustang's story wasn't finished. It went on to fight in new wars, over Korea, in the Middle East, and across the developing world. Wherever it flew, people recognized that unmistakable sound, the deep, confident growl of the Merlin engine. To those who had lived through 1944, it was the sound of freedom. But perhaps the Mustang's greatest legacy wasn't in battle. It was in what came after. When peace returned, former enemies began to rebuild, and something remarkable happened. Many of the same German pilots who had once fought to the death against the Mustangs were invited to join the new, democratic German Air Force. Some even trained alongside their former American adversaries, Johannes Steinhoff, who had been burned in a crash and left scarred for life, went on to become Chief of Staff of the post-war Luftwaffe and later chairman of NATO's military committee. In 1983, He stood beside American generals who had once flown Mustangs against him. They laughed, shared stories, and raised glasses together. At that meeting, Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's legendary general of fighters, gave a toast that no one ever forgot. He said, "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. You shocked us again when you helped us rebuild. The Mustangs ended a war, but they also began a peace." The irony was complete. The same aircraft that had once destroyed Germany's air force now symbolized the friendship that would protect it from the Soviet threat. The circle had closed. In those post-war years, the Mustang became more than a fighter. It became a teacher. It taught engineers how to design for speed and range. It taught nations how to organize production on a massive scale. And it taught the world that freedom, when defended with unity and courage, could achieve miracles. Every modern jet fighter, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor, owes something to the lessons learned from the Mustang. Its blend of range, speed, balance, and reliability became the blueprint for all that followed. But beyond the machines, there was something deeper. The Mustang had proven that technology meant nothing without the will to use it wisely. It wasn't the metal that won. It was the minds behind it, the engineers, the workers, the pilots, the people. For many veterans, the war never truly ended. They carried the sounds, the smells, and the memories for the rest of their lives. For German survivors, that sound of the Mustang engine became a haunting echo, both terrifying and strangely comforting. It meant the end of the nightmare, the end of lies, and the start of something new. When you see a restored P-51 Mustang fly today at an air show, you can still feel that history in the air. The polished aluminum gleams in the sunlight. The propeller's hum deepens into that rich Merlin growl. People look up, children point, and old veterans close their eyes. Some smile, some cry. All remember, because that sound isn't just a sound, it's a reminder. It reminds us of a moment when courage met innovation, when belief in freedom conquered fear. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires can fall if they underestimate the power of human creativity. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg that cold March morning, he couldn't have imagined how much the world would change. In that instant, he saw the future of air power, of warfare, of history itself. From that day on, no nation could ever again assume that distance would protect it. The Mustang had erased the map. It wasn't just an airplane crossing the sky, it was an idea crossing an ocean. And that idea would define the modern world. That freedom, when armed with knowledge and determination, could reach anywhere. The war ended, but the echoes of those engines never did. Even decades later, when veterans spoke of it, their eyes would drift upward, as if they could still hear the hum of Mustangs somewhere high above the clouds. For some, that sound meant victory. For others, it meant loss. But for everyone who lived through that era, it meant change. The kind of change that rewrites the world. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a machine of war, it was a messenger. It told the world that no distance was safe, that innovation could break any barrier, and that freedom, once set in motion, could cross oceans and mountains alike. When Hermann Göring said at Nuremberg, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the war was lost," he wasn't just admitting defeat. He was confessing something deeper. That belief in superiority had been shattered by belief in progress. That moment, March 6, 1944, became more than a page in history. It became a turning point for humanity. From that day, warfare would never again be local or contained. The sky itself had become the battlefield, and whoever ruled it ruled the future. But the Mustang's story didn't end in the ruins of Berlin. It lived on, in every jet that took off after, in every pilot who learned that courage was not about invincibility but about purpose. It lived on in friendships that no one could have imagined during the war. Years later, American and German pilots who once tried to kill each other would meet at reunions. They would share stories, laugh, even toast each other's bravery. Men like Johannes Steinhoff, whose face bore the scars of his crash, would shake hands with men like Bud Anderson, who had fought him in the sky. At one such meeting, Steinhoff said softly, "When your Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we thought you were bringing death. We didn't know you were bringing the beginning of peace. And maybe that was the Mustang's greatest secret. It ended a war, but it also helped build the peace that followed." Because what came after 1945 was something the world had never seen before. Nations once at war becoming allies. Enemies becoming protectors. The same skies once filled with combat now filled with cooperation. In 1984, at an air show in Texas, something extraordinary happened. A restored silver P-51 Mustang took off to the sound of applause. In the crowd stood both American veterans and former Luftwaffe pilots. When the Merlin engine roared to life, the noise silenced the audience. Some smiled. Some cried. And among them, Adolf Galland, once the pride of the German Air Force, stood and clapped. He turned to the man beside him and said, "That sound, it used to mean the end. Now it means the beginning." The Mustang's story was never just about metal, horsepower, or range. It was about what humanity can do when it refuses to accept the impossible. It proved that progress doesn't belong to tyrants. It belongs to those who dream, who build, who believe. Every rivet, every bolt, every gallon of fuel that carried those Mustangs to Berlin was a promise that free people, when united, can achieve the extraordinary. Today, more than 80 years later, a few Mustangs still fly. Their polished wings shine like mirrors in the sunlight. Their pilots, often the grandchildren of the men who built them, take off into the sky not for war but to remember. When they fly overhead, people stop what they're doing and look up. The engine's hum rolls across the air like an echo from another time. For a few seconds, you can almost see what those German pilots saw in 1944, the impossible, shimmering in the sky. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still tell this story. Because it reminds us that no matter how dark the world becomes, innovation, courage, and unity can always bring the light back. History is full of wars, but it's also full of lessons. And the story of the P-51 Mustang is one of the greatest of them all. It teaches us that progress always wins over pride, that teamwork defeats tyranny, and that even the mightiest fall when they stop believing in change. So the next time you hear that soft roar in the distance, remember, it's not just an airplane. It's the sound of what humanity can achieve when it works together. And if stories like this move you, if you believe history isn't just about the past but about what we learn for the future, then don't just watch. Be part of it. Hit that subscribe button right now. Join this journey as we uncover more untold stories that shaped the world. Every week we bring history to life, stories of courage, innovation, and the moments that changed everything. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Did the sound of those Mustangs give you chills? Did it make you think about what courage truly means? We read every single comment, and your thoughts inspire the next story, because this channel isn't just about history. It's about people. It's about us. About remembering that behind every machine, every moment, and every victory, there are human hearts beating, dreaming, and daring to go further. So subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who loves history, someone who believes that courage and innovation still matter. Let's keep these stories alive because they remind us of who we are and who we can still become. The sky may be quieter now, but its lessons still echo. And somewhere, high above the clouds, the sound of a Merlin engine still whispers through the air, reminding us that freedom, once earned, must always be protected. That's the legacy of the Mustang. Not destruction, not domination, but endurance, courage, and hope. And that's why decades later, when we look up and see a silver wing glinting in the sunlight, we smile. Because it means we still remember.